My name is Daniel Ortiz. I am 51 years old. I am the operations director for my family's grocery store chain in Phoenix, Arizona. And at my father's retirement dinner, in front of 200 employees, vendors, and relatives, my brother-in-law stood up with a microphone and accused me of stealing $180,000 from the company I had spent 26 years building. He didn't do it quietly. He did it during the toast, right after my father had finished thanking everyone for 40 years of loyalty. Right as the room was still warm with applause, he raised his glass, smiled at the crowd the way he always smiled at crowds, and said, "Before we celebrate any further, I think there's something the family needs to be honest about tonight." I remember the specific way the room shifted. 200 people, mid-swallow, mid-laugh, mid-conversation, all turning toward the small stage at the front of the banquet hall at once. My father's face, still glowing from his own speech, slowly rearranging itself into confusion. "Daniel has been paying himself unauthorized consulting fees for the last 2 years, Victor said, his voice smooth and practiced, the voice of a man who had clearly rehearsed this moment more than once in front of a mirror. $180,000, routed through a shell vendor account. I only found it because I was doing a routine audit last month." I sat there in my chair, my father's retirement cake still uncut on the table in front of me, and I felt something very specific settle over me. Not panic, not embarrassment, something colder and steadier than either of those things. Because I knew exactly where that $180,000 had actually gone. And it wasn't into my pocket. I had known about it for almost 2 years. I had the invoices. I had the wire transfer records. I had the emails. And every single piece of it led directly back to the man holding the microphone. If you're enjoying stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. To understand how I ended up sitting in a rented banquet hall being accused of theft by my own sister's husband, you have to go back almost 30 years, to the back office of a single grocery store on the south side of Phoenix, where my father, Ruben Ortiz, was still counting the day's register receipts by hand every night at closing. My father came to Arizona from Sonora, Mexico when he was 19 years old, with almost nothing, and worked stockrooms and loading docks for a decade before he saved enough to buy a small, struggling corner market that nobody else wanted. He built Ortiz Family Market from that one location into 11 stores across the Phoenix metro area over the next 35 years, through a combination of stubbornness, instinct, and an old-fashioned belief that if you treated your employees and your customers like family, the business would take care of itself. I grew up in the back offices of those stores, literally. My earliest memories aren't of a playground or a living room. They're of sitting under a desk in the store on Van Buren Street, doing my third-grade homework on the floor, while my father argued with a produce supplier over the price of tomatoes. By the time I was 12, I could stock a shelf faster than most of the adult employees. By 16, I was doing informal inventory counts on weekends, catching discrepancies before the store manager even noticed them. I have an older brother, Miguel, 3 years ahead of me. And for most of my childhood, Miguel was the one my father talked about becoming the future of the company. He was charming in a way I never quite was, quick with a joke, comfortable in front of customers, the kind of person a room naturally gathered around. My father used to say, only half joking, that Miguel had the face of the business, and I had the mind of the business. And for years, I told myself that was a compliment, even though I noticed, even as a teenager, that faces got invited to more things than minds did. Miguel went to business school. I went to Arizona State and studied logistics and supply chain management, a decision my father openly questioned at the time. Boxes and trucks, Daniel? You could run a company someday, and you want to study boxes and trucks? I didn't have a clever answer for him back then. I just knew, somewhere in my gut, that understanding how things actually moved through a business, the money, the inventory, the paperwork trail behind every transaction, mattered more than being good at speeches. I never resented Miguel for the attention he got. Not really. Not for a long time. He was my brother, and I loved him. And in fairness to him, he did work hard in his own way. I remember one summer when I was 17, working the overnight inventory shift at the Van Buren store because our regular night crew was short-staffed. I stayed until 4 in the morning, recounting an entire dairy section by hand after the automated scanner malfunctioned, because I knew my father would need accurate numbers before the truck arrived at 6. Nobody thanked me for it the next day. Nobody even noticed. That was fine with me, mostly, because I had already learned that the reward for that kind of work wasn't praise. It was trust, quiet and slow building, and I told myself trust would eventually be worth more than applause. The trouble started about 15 years ago, when my father, eager to hand Miguel a piece of the company to prove himself with, backed a new concept store Miguel wanted to launch, a premium organic grocery brand, entirely separate from the family market chain, funded almost entirely out of company reserves. It failed within 2 years. Not because Miguel didn't try, but because he had never learned the parts of the business that actually kept a store alive. The supplier negotiations, the inventory turnover, the razor-thin margins that require someone paying close attention every single week. My father absorbed the loss quietly, wrote it off as a lesson, and Miguel drifted away from the company not long after, eventually moving to Colorado to work in a completely different industry. My father never spoke badly of him. He just stopped mentioning the future of the company in the same breath as Miguel's name. I want to be honest with you. Some small, petty part of me expected that once Miguel stepped back, my father would finally turn to me. He didn't, not exactly. What happened instead was more complicated, and it involved my sister Elena's husband, Victor Reyes. Victor married Elena about 12 years ago. He came from a finance background, sharp suits, an MBA, a way of speaking about numbers that made everyone in the room feel like they were watching a professional. My father, still stinging from the failed organic store venture, found something deeply reassuring about Victor's polish. Here was a man who talked about EBITDA and vendor consolidation and quarterly forecasting with total confidence, in a way that made my father feel like the business was finally being handled by someone who understood the bigger picture. I never disliked Victor, not at first. I actually welcomed the help. Running 11 stores had become genuinely complicated, and having someone with a finance background involved seemed reasonable. Victor started attending leadership meetings. Then he started reviewing vendor contracts. Then, gradually, over the course of about 3 years, he became the person my father consulted before making any major financial decision, while I remained the person my father consulted about whether the trucks were running on time. What I didn't know then was how carefully Victor had positioned himself to become indispensable, or how much of that positioning depended on my father never looking too closely at the numbers Victor was the only one fully explaining. The first thing I noticed, almost 3 years ago now, was small. A produce vendor we'd worked with for over a decade quietly stopped supplying 2 of our stores, replaced by a new vendor with slightly higher prices and, according to our receiving logs, noticeably inconsistent quality. When I asked about the switch in a leadership meeting, Victor explained it smoothly. Better payment terms, a modernized ordering system, a long-term cost savings that would show up further down the line. My father nodded along. Nobody else in the room questioned it. I let it go. The way you let go of something that feels slightly wrong but not wrong enough yet to justify making a scene about it. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part came about 18 months later, when I was doing a routine review of our shipping and receiving discrepancies, something I did quarterly, out of habit, long before Victor ever arrived. And I found a vendor account I didn't recognize. A company called Desert Sun Consulting, receiving regular payments from the corporate account for supply chain advisory services. I had never heard of Desert Sun Consulting. I had never approved any supply chain advisory contract. And as the operations director, any supply chain advisory contract should have crossed my desk. I pulled the registration records for Desert Sun Consulting the following week, using a business database I had access to through an old contact in county records. The company had been registered 14 months earlier. Its registered agent was a lawyer whose office, according to public filings, also handled Victor's personal tax documents. I didn't confront anyone. Not yet. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was that I wasn't fully certain what I was looking at. A coincidence, technically, could still exist. But if I'm being fully truthful, part of it was fear. An old fear I recognized from childhood. The fear of being the brother who caused a problem, who disrupted the smooth, confident version of the business my father had finally, after Miguel's failure, started to feel good about again. So instead, I did what I've always done well. I started keeping records. I saved copies of every Desert Sun Consulting invoice that crossed our accounting system, cross-referenced against actual deliverables, of which there appeared to be almost none. I tracked the vendor switch on the produce contracts and quietly reached out to our old produce supplier, who told me, off the record, over coffee, that they had actually offered better pricing than the new vendor, but had been told the decision came from above and wasn't up for negotiation. I kept screenshots of internal emails where Victor authorized payments without the required second signature our own company bylaws required for anything over $10,000. Slowly, methodically, over about 2 years, I built a folder, digital, backed up in 3 places, organized by date, that told a story very different from the one Victor had been telling my father in leadership meetings. What I didn't know, not for a long time, was how much money we were actually talking about. I assumed it was serious. I didn't know it was $180,000 until I finally sat down, about 4 months before my father's retirement dinner, and added every single Desert Sun Consulting payment together, going back to the very first one. There was a night, about 6 months into building that folder, when Elena called me, sounding worried, asking if everything was all right between Victor and me. Apparently, he'd mentioned, offhand, that I seemed distant lately, always asking odd questions about vendor contracts. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone against my ear, choosing my words carefully. "I've just been doing a deeper review of operations spending," I told her, which was true, if incomplete. I didn't tell her what I'd found. I've thought about that phone call many times since, wondering whether I should have said more, whether it would have spared her something. I don't think it would have. I think she needed to see the proof herself, the way everyone else eventually did, rather than hear a warning secondhand from a brother she had no particular reason to believe over her own husband. I should have gone to my father right then. I've thought about that decision more times than I can count since that night at the banquet hall. But my father had just announced his retirement date, after 40 years of work, and Victor had already begun positioning himself, in ways both subtle and not, as the natural choice to take over as CEO once my father stepped down. I told myself I needed a little more time to build an airtight case, something so complete that there would be no room for Victor to talk his way around it. What I didn't fully account for was that Victor, sensing that I had started asking quiet questions around the office, a vendor contact here, an old email search there, might decide to get ahead of me first. That's exactly what happened. 3 weeks before the retirement dinner, when Victor requested a private meeting with my father and told him, according to what my father later relayed to me, that he had discovered irregularities in operations spending that he believed traced back to unauthorized payments I had been personally directing. He didn't have evidence, not real evidence, only a handful of manipulated numbers and the confident tone he'd spent years perfecting in front of my father. But confidence, delivered convincingly enough, can look a great deal like proof to someone who wants very badly to trust the person delivering it. I didn't know any of this had happened until the night of the dinner, when Victor stood up with that microphone in his hand. The retirement dinner itself was held at a banquet hall my father had rented for the occasion, decorated with photographs from all 11 stores over the decades, a slideshow of 40 years of hard work playing on a screen behind the podium. Employees who had worked for my father since the very first store came up one after another to share memories, to thank him, to cry a little. It was, up until that toast, one of the most genuinely joyful nights our family had shared in years. Then Victor stood up. $180,000, he repeated, letting the number sit in the silence of the room, routed through a shell vendor called Desert Sun Consulting. I have the wire records right here if anyone wants to see them. He held up a folder of his own, thinner than mine, but held with the same confident posture. My father turned to me. I will never forget his face in that exact moment. Not anger yet, just a terrible, bewildered hurt. The look of a man watching the last night of his working life fall apart in front of 200 people he had spent decades earning the respect of. "Daniel," he said quietly, "is this true?" I want you to understand something about that moment. I could have exploded. I could have shouted Victor down in front of the entire room, could have called him a liar to his face, could have let 26 years of quiet frustration finally boil over in front of every vendor and employee we'd ever worked with. Some part of me, in that instant, wanted to. I didn't. I stood up slowly, buttoned my jacket, and asked my father for the microphone. "Dad," I said, "Desert Sun Consulting is real. The payments are real. $180,000 is roughly accurate. Maybe a little low, actually, once you account for the last quarter." I let that land for a moment, watching Victor's confident expression flicker for the first time all night. But I didn't create that vendor account, and I've never received a single dollar from it. "Then who did?" my father asked. I opened my own folder. I laid out the registration records first, showing that Desert Sun Consulting had been registered by a lawyer whose office also handled Victor's personal taxes. A detail I asked our family's longtime attorney, sitting at table 6, to confirm publicly, which he did, visibly uncomfortable after glancing at the paperwork. I showed the missing second signatures on every payment above $10,000, a violation of company bylaws that Victor himself had helped my father write 3 years earlier, ironically, as part of his own push for better financial controls. I read, out loud, an email in which Victor personally approved a Desert Sun Consulting invoice for market analysis services, the same week our internal calendar showed him on vacation in Cabo San Lucas with Elena, a detail my sister herself, sitting at the family table, confirmed with a small, stricken nod before she even realized what she was doing. "I have 2 years of this," I said, keeping my voice steady, resisting every urge to let it shake with everything I was actually feeling. Every payment, every discrepancy, every vendor switch that mysteriously benefited a company registered to Victor's own tax attorney. I didn't want to believe it either, for a long time. That's part of why it took me 2 years to be sure enough to say anything. The room did not erupt into shouting. 200 people sat in a stunned, uncomfortable quiet, the kind that settles over a room when something true and ugly has just become impossible to unsee. I watched vendors who had dealt with Victor directly over the past 3 years quietly reassess conversations they'd clearly had with him. I watched employees who had heard him talk about modernizing operations in staff meetings realize what that modernization had actually paid for. Our old produce supplier, Ray Chen, was seated near the back of the hall. My father had invited him out of decades-old loyalty, even after the contract had ended. He stood up, unprompted, and said he wanted to say something, if that was all right. My father nodded, still too stunned to do much more than that. I offered your company better pricing than what you switched to, Ray said, looking directly at Victor rather than at my father. I was told the decision came from above and wasn't up for discussion. I didn't know who above meant until just now. Nobody said anything for a long moment after that. I could hear the air conditioning humming somewhere overhead, the faint clink of someone's fork against a plate 3 tables away, the small, ordinary sounds of a room that had gone very still around one enormous, undeniable fact. My sister Elena did not defend her husband that night. I want to say that clearly, because it mattered enormously to me, then and now. She sat very still for a long moment, staring at the folder in front of me. And then she stood up, walked over, and asked quietly if she could see the Cabo email for herself. She read it twice, her hand pressed flat against the table as though she needed it to stay steady. Then she looked at Victor, and whatever passed between them in that look, I will never fully know. But I do know she didn't say a single word in his defense, that night or any night after. Victor tried, briefly, to argue that the payments represented legitimate advisory work, that the missing signatures were an oversight, that the timing of the Cabo email was a coincidence. But confidence without evidence collapses very quickly once real evidence is sitting on the table in front of it. And within a few minutes, even the guests who barely knew our family could see which folder told the truth. My father did not fire Victor that night, in front of everyone, though I think some part of the room expected him to. What he did instead was quieter, and in its own way, more devastating. He stood up, thanked everyone for coming, said that the family had some private matters to discuss, and asked that the celebration continue without them needing to be part of it. Then, he asked Victor, Elena, and me to step into a side room, where, over the next hour, the real conversation happened, away from an audience, the way I think my father wanted it to happen from the start, if Victor hadn't forced his hand at the podium. What followed over the next several months was not a lawsuit, though our family attorney advised us we would likely have won one easily. My father, after everything, still didn't want Victor publicly destroyed, both for Elena's sake and for the sake of the company's reputation with the vendors and employees who trusted the Ortiz name. Instead, Victor was formally removed from any role in the company, required to repay the full $180,000 through a structured settlement, and Elena, after a difficult few months of her own, separated from him the following spring. I became the operations lead for the transition into my father's retirement, not through some dramatic promotion ceremony, but simply because, once the noise settled, everyone in the company already knew who had been quietly running the real numbers the entire time. I became the operations lead for the transition into my father's retirement, not through some dramatic promotion ceremony, but simply because, once the noise settled, everyone in the company already knew who had been quietly running the real numbers the entire time. It took the better part of a year to fully unwind everything Victor had touched, renegotiating with Ray Chen's produce company, auditing every contract Victor had personally signed off on over the previous 3 years, rebuilding trust with 2 vendors who had quietly begun doing business elsewhere after hearing rumors about instability at the top. None of it happened overnight. There was no single dramatic moment where everything snapped back into place. It was slow, careful, unglamorous work. The same kind of work I had always done, just louder now, with more people paying attention to it than ever before. My father and I had a long conversation on his back porch a few weeks after the dinner, the 2 of us alone, the way we hadn't talked in years. He apologized to me, in a voice I had rarely heard him use, for spending so many years chasing the version of success that talked the loudest, while the version that simply did the work correctly, year after year, sat quietly in the next room, waiting to be noticed. He told me he understood now why I'd studied boxes and trucks instead of speeches, and that he was sorrier than he could say that it took a banquet hall full of people for him to finally see it clearly. I think about that night often, especially now, running the company my father spent 40 years building, doing the same quiet, careful work I've always done, checking the numbers, verifying the invoices, trusting nothing I haven't personally confirmed. I never wanted to be the man who exposed his own brother-in-law in front of 200 people at his father's retirement party. There was no triumph in it, not really. Not the kind people expect from stories like this one. What I felt, standing there with that folder in my hands, wasn't victory. It was relief. The same specific, exhausted relief of finally setting down something I had been carrying quietly, alone, for far too long. If there's a lesson in what happened that night, I think it's this. The people who do the unglamorous work, year after year, without asking for the spotlight, are often the last ones anyone expects to be holding the real evidence when it finally matters. Victor spent 3 years assuming I was too slow, too quiet, too focused on boxes and trucks to ever notice what he was doing. He was wrong about the first 2 things. He was right, in a way, about the third. I was focused on the boxes and trucks, and it turned out that's exactly where the truth had been hiding the entire time. Some nights, walking the floor of the Van Buren store after closing, the same store where I sat under a desk doing homework almost 40 years ago, I think about how close that truth came to staying buried. If Victor had waited even a little longer to make his move, if he'd sensed how close my own folder was to being finished, he might have chosen a different approach entirely, one I might never have been able to answer as cleanly in front of 200 people. I don't dwell on that thought for long. What matters in the end isn't how close it came to going differently. What matters is that it didn't, and that the business my father spent 40 years building is still standing, still run by people who show up and do the quiet work correctly, one honest number at a time. Thank you for listening my story.